Welcome to the Economics of Me podcast. This is the second episode of the Economics of Me podcast, your place for making sense of the economics of everyday life. Born out of my own learning, our mission is to simplify concepts, economics, and business, bringing it all back to first principles and what it means to you. And as we are telling stories, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Wangal people of the Darug Nation, on which I'm recording this podcast. The Wangal people have been telling stories for over a millennia, and I'm committed to treading lightly on these lands as we move forward to a future of reconciliation. Why do things keep getting more expensive? What is inflation, and what does it all mean? How did this period of inflation come about, and why does it affect me and how I live my life? Today, on the second episode of the Economics of Me podcast, we talk about the economics of inflation. So let's dig deeper. We've heard the word inflation a lot over the last 2 years, and I guess it's been kind of constant headlines around the broader challenges of the cost of living crisis that many of us face. This is something that affects us every day, and it's not something that is so far removed that we don't feel it or kind of see it. We're hearing about it, we're seeing it, we're feeling it in our wallets, and it's impacting our life. Things continue to get more expensive. Again, when you show up to your supermarket, when you fill up your car, when you pay your rent, things kind of creep ahead. But what is inflation? How does it work? Why does it affect me? So again, what is inflation? To put it simply, inflation is the increase in the level of prices. Basically, things getting more expensive. We've talked about this in the previous episode, this measure of CPI. And to refresh everyone, the Consumer Price Index is really a kind of formal measure of inflation that takes a wide-ranging basket of goods and kind of tracks the movements of these prices, into a big sort of aggregated figure, a big number. But inflation itself is both a theory and actually an actuality. And so to kind of frame it up, I think we need a deep dive into Economics 101 and talk about this idea of supply and demand. So in simple terms, what is supply and demand? So let's start with supply. Supply is the amount of a product or a service that businesses are willing and able to sell at sort of varying prices, so high or low. And I guess the basic idea is that when generally the higher the price, more product businesses are willing to supply because they can kind of make a profit on each sale. Then you think about demand. Demand is the amount of product or a service that consumers or us are willing to buy at varying prices. And I guess back to the basic idea, typically when lower the price, more product us consumers are willing to buy because it's much more affordable. And then, so how do prices kind of change? If demand increases, so basically more people like us want a product. And I guess a great example of this is, right, do you remember in COVID when rat tests were impossible to get? But supplies kind of stay the same. Prices tend to go up. If supply increases, so more of a product is available, anyone's heard of a sale time when everything's got to go, like stock take sale, right? So someone has bought way too much stock and they need it to be sold. But demand kind of stays the same, so prices go down. If demand decreases, so fewer people want a product, think about film cameras when digital photography came through, the opposite happens. And I guess the last sort of one of this is when supply decreases. When you think about, it's really common when, like, say, a cyclone hits banana growers, the fruit's damaged, it's not saleable anymore, but the same amount of people want bananas at Woolies. What happens? Prices shoot upwards. So basically, this kind of back and forth, this dichotomy of supply and demand determines the price of things that we buy. So back to the economics of inflation. As I said before, it's really easy to see inflation as a set of numbers. Sometimes those numbers, and I talked about CPI before, are really so far removed from what you see every day. A kind of 6% aggregate CPI figure means really little to you when you visit your grocer, right? And you get your bill shocked because things used to cost $50 Now they cost $65. What you want to know is kind of why, or maybe that's just me, but I think it's important to try to understand this and our place in it all. I like to think about inflation as a theory or a set of principles, and then try to understand how it informs our everyday. And there's really only three main theories of inflation. So again, this idea of inflation is really rooted in this supply and demand dichotomy, right? So to start it off, we've got the first one called demand pull inflation. Prices basically go up because lots of people like us want to buy things, but there really isn't enough goods or services to meet that high demand. So what's an example of this? If everyone wants to buy the newest iPhone, but there isn't enough stock to really satiate that demand, basically Apple could kind of say, hey, I'm going to push the prices up if I want to. The second one is called cost push inflation. So basically here, prices rise because it costs more to make goods and services. And businesses have to pass that cost on to someone, usually us. A good example here is if the price of oil goes up, it becomes more expensive to produce and transport goods, and so then companies inevitably raise their prices. The last one is called built-in or wage price spiral inflation. So what happens here? Prices go up because workers want higher wages to keep up with the cost of living, and then businesses then raise prices to cover those higher wages, leading to this like endless cycle of rising costs. So again, breaking it down into an example. If prices for everyday items increase, like your cost of goods at your Woolies, workers might demand higher pay. When they get it, businesses then raise prices again to cover the higher wage, really continuing this sort of vicious cycle. Sound familiar? The headlines, what you're hearing from your families and friends, what you're seeing in your bank statements all echo these theories that I've talked to. How did this all come about? What is the path ahead? Let's unpack. So if we zoom out and look back over the last 12 to 18 months, Australia's inflation rate as of late 2023 was at 8% year on year. So that's basically the price of goods growing 8% from a year earlier. That's heaps. And currently it's at 3.8% as of August 2024. So this is a bit higher than the RBA's target band of between 2 and 3%. And we'll speak more about this in the next episode. But I guess what I want to understand now is how did this all happen? Firstly, remember supply chain disruptions. Do we remember COVID? Or have we all kind of put that into a deep dark part of our brain that we'll never get back to? And geopolitical tensions. So remember that wars affect oil prices. What happened is that basically this has disrupted global supply chains. So really how things get from A to B. And these disruptions kind of lead to the shortage of goods and increased production costs at the same time, really making things more expensive. The second big one was really rising energy prices. So if you think about energy prices, particularly for oil and gas, these saw really significant increases due to these tensions and reduced supplies as well. And basically higher cost for fuel equals higher cost for transportation, which then equals higher cost for manufacturing, and then that equals higher cost for utilities. And when businesses face this, someone has to bear the brunt of it, usually us. The third part is really around labor market tightness. So we had really tight labor market with record low unemployment rates just coming out of COVID. And this really created upward pressure on wages as businesses really started to compete for a limited pool of workers. You have to remember that really borders were shut between 2021 and 2022, but businesses still had to function, right? And they still had to grow. I guess the fourth big bit is really around housing market pressures. The housing market in Australia really remains under pressure. I mean, anyone who's trying to buy a house right now, anyone who's trying to rent can tell you that. And so higher living costs also equals higher inflation. The fifth one, and probably one of the biggest ones, is really government stimulus measures. So really the Australian government implemented various stimulus measures across that period to support the economy. Does anyone remember JobKeeper? Where essentially free money was given out to keep the economy afloat. Whilst you can kind of argue that these measures were really needed socially to kind of give people a chance to sort of stay afloat and live their lives with some dignity, it also increased this idea of money supply. And so again, money supply being kind of like cheap or free money. And then what happens is that people kind of want to use it for something. And what does that do? It pushes up this demand side again. And so if you think about it, it really was the perfect storm. So where to from here? The RBA really only has one tool at its disposal, and that is interest rates. And kind of interest rates can be really seen as this kind of blunt instrument. It's kind of this big swinging axe to the tree trunk that's the economy. Let's clarify what we mean by blunt instrument. So we acknowledge that while they're powerful, interest rates aren't always precise. So the RBA adjusts interest rates to either cool down the economy or to stimulate the economy, depending on whether inflation is running too hot or too cold. But the challenge here lies in how the rates, basically affect the entire economy, rather than just targeting specific areas that are causing inflation. So it really is this kind of like blunt tool. When the RBA raises interest rates to combat inflation, what happens is that borrowing costs go up. And this means that, you would have heard this in the news, higher mortgage repayments for homeowners, more expensive loans for businesses, and really anyone that's got relying on any debt or any credit, there's this kind of like general tightening of the belt. The idea here is to reduce spending and borrowing, which in turn should really bring down inflation. But here's the catch. Higher interest rates can also impact people differently. For some, it might be cutting back on discretionary spending. So you stop buying TVs, you stop going on holidays. While for others, it can really push them to the brink of financial hardship. And for those who are already struggling, it can really feel like they've been hit by the hardest measure designed to help everyone else. The economics of inflation is not all equal. And this brings us to why this is important. We've talked about inflation and how framing it up as a set of principles or theory could be really a good way to understand that it affects all of us every single day. Whether you're buying groceries or paying your rent or planning your next holiday, inflation directly impacts how far your money goes. When prices rise faster than your income or your wage, which they have been for the last 12 to 24 months, it can kind of feel like your wallet is shrinking. And that's why understanding the economics of inflation is really important. But it's not just about the here and now. Inflation also influences really big life decisions. Are you thinking about taking out a mortgage? Remember how we just spoke about the RBA's blunt instrument and interest rates? This is influenced by inflation and basically determines how much house you can afford. Inflation both has an impact on your everyday, but also your path ahead. And let's not forget that inflation also plays a bigger part of the broader economy. It affects everything from how businesses price their products to how government manages its budget. That supply and demand balance we talked about earlier. When inflation is stable, it basically creates a more predictable environment for everyone. The economics of inflation can be driven by factors like rising energy costs, supply chain disruptions, changes in wages, things that are kind of largely out of our control. But by understanding these dynamics, you can start to influence things within your control, your everyday. Whether it's about negotiating a pay rise, where you choose to invest your money, or simply when you want to buy things. So the economics of inflation is really about what we see and what we feel every day, how we live our lives. And with this, how do we all feel now? Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your time. If you enjoyed the first few episodes and feel compelled to subscribe, that would really help our little channel. In the next episode, we'll talk about interest rates and its role in the economics that inform your everyday life. You can find the Economics of Me podcast anywhere you listen to your podcasts.